He was driving down the highway as usual, never suspecting that this trip would change everything. Suddenly, the truck skidded and overturned right in the middle of the road. Hundreds of blue barrels rolled across the asphalt, scattering in every direction. When the police officer opened one of them, he couldn't believe his eyes. Inside was something no one ever expected to see. Subscribe to the channel and don't forget to comment where you're watching this video from. The dawn rose slowly over the industrial outskirts of Houston, dissolving the last remains of night into a pale orange haze. The air was still, heavy with the scent of oil, warm asphalt, and damp dust that clung to the rows of warehouses stretching toward the horizon. In the parking lot behind a faded logistics terminal, a single truck idled quietly, its diesel engine humming with a steady rhythm, the exhaust forming lazy spirals that disappeared into the sky. Behind the wheel sat Michael Hayes, a man of 43, his face marked by the fine lines of long roads and sleepless nights. His eyes, a shade of tired gray, carried the calm of someone who had seen too many miles to be surprised by anything new. Michael had been a truck driver for over 2 decades, long enough to know that routine could become both a comfort and a prison. He had once loved the open road, the way the headlights carved their path through darkness, the endless music of tires humming over the interstate. But now, each trip blurred into the next. He lived between destinations, never quite belonging anywhere. His apartment, a small place above a laundromat on the city's east side, was more a storage unit for his belongings than a home. The road was what he understood. The rest of life had become too unpredictable. That morning, he was assigned a new delivery, a route he'd taken countless times before. Houston to Tucson, a straight run across Texas, past San Antonio, through Fort Stockton, and along the vast stretches of desert highway that seemed to go on forever. The paperwork was simple. 32 blue industrial barrels labeled as non-hazardous emulsions. Standard cargo for construction suppliers, nothing unusual. The pickup point was a warehouse he had visited once or twice before, though he remembered it now with a faint sense of unease. Something about it, the silence of the workers, the way the security guard had eyed him during his last visit, had stayed with him longer than expected. When he arrived at the yard just before sunrise, the warehouse lights were still on, casting a pale glow over the trucks being loaded. Forklifts whined, metal clanged, and men in identical gray uniforms moved briskly between pallets. Michael stepped out of his cab, nodded to a loader he didn't recognize, and began his usual inspection routine. Check the tires, clean the mirrors, verify the brake lines, note the mileage. Everything was as it should be, except for one detail: the presence of security. 2 men in dark jackets stood near the gate, not speaking, their eyes scanning the yard as if guarding something far more valuable than barrels of industrial fluid. He walked toward the loading dock, watching as the forklift driver maneuvered another barrel into the container. The barrels were all the same size and color, clean, unmarked, except for faint embossed codes on their lids. No hazard symbols, no company logos, just a uniform sea of blue plastic. It struck Michael as oddly careful, like someone had gone out of their way to make the shipment look unremarkable. The dock supervisor, a middle-aged man with a clipboard and restless eyes, approached him. "You're the driver for Tucson?" the man asked, not quite meeting Michael's gaze. Michael nodded, signing the paperwork without thinking much of it. The supervisor's hands trembled slightly as he handed over the documents. "You'll want to take the south route," he muttered. "Less wind that way." "Always the wind," Michael said absently, folding the papers and tucking them into his logbook. The supervisor didn't respond. When the last barrel was loaded and the door sealed, Michael took a photo of the new Plomby seal, a habit he had developed over the years after, once being blamed for a missing crate. The timestamp on his phone blinked 6:14. As he climbed into the cab, he couldn't help but notice a white chalk mark near the trailer's number. A series of letters and numbers scrawled quickly, half erased by a boot print. It wasn't part of any standard shipping code he recognized. He considered wiping it off, but decided against it. Probably just some worker's note, he thought, and started the engine. The road out of the industrial park wound through low warehouses and empty lots lined with flickering streetlights. Michael caught sight of his reflection in the side mirror. The tired face, the faint gray stubble, the creases beneath his eyes. He remembered a time when he'd look in the mirror before a trip and feel something. Pride, maybe, or anticipation. Now it was just another morning, another haul, another long stretch of highway between himself and silence. As he merged onto the interstate, the city fell away behind him. The sun rose higher, and the flatlands opened up, a vast mosaic of fields and power lines and the occasional Ruston water tower. The hum of the engine was steady, comforting in its familiarity. He kept the speed at a cautious 65, letting faster trucks overtake him. The wind was already picking up, buffeting the trailer lightly, though nothing he hadn't handled before. Somewhere near Columbus, he stopped for gas and coffee. The convenience store was half empty, a sleepy place with old country music playing from a dusty radio. The cashier, a young man with tattoos down his arms, barely looked up as Michael paid. On his way out, another driver, a colleague from a different company, called out his name. "Hayes, you still running for Darlon Freight?" Michael turned. It was Bobby Kearns, someone he'd known for years, the kind of man who always had a story to tell. "Yeah," Michael said. "Why?" Bobby frowned. "Heard something weird. A buddy of mine went by that same warehouse last week. Said it looked more like a military site than a supplier yard. Extra guards, no signage. He got turned away for asking the wrong questions." Michael shrugged it off with a faint smile. "As long as the check clears, I don't ask questions." But even as he said it, a small discomfort lodged itself in his mind. He got back into his truck and looked again at the paperwork. The forms were precise. Typed names, digital stamps, everything official. But one line caught his attention. The product description was vague. Non-hazardous liquid compound, code 47B. Usually, such codes referred to manufacturer specifications, but there was no company name beside it. He thought briefly of calling dispatch to double-check, then dismissed the idea. Too much hassle. The afternoon sun was glaring when he reached the open desert highway past San Antonio. Heat shimmered on the horizon, and the road stretched endlessly forward. There was a strange peace in it, the kind that only solitude could bring. Michael turned on his radio, flipping through channels until he found a weather report warning of strong crosswinds west of Ozona. He noted it silently, adjusted his grip on the wheel, and carried on. Hours passed. The scenery shifted from scrubland to low hills dotted with mesquite trees, then back again to flat desert. The monotony lulled his mind, drawing him into that familiar rhythm of thought where the world outside faded into background noise. He thought of his daughter in Dallas, whom he hadn't seen in months, of the mountain bills, of the feeling that life was quietly slipping away, mile by mile. The truck was his only constant, his moving cocoon of noise and solitude. As the light began to fade, the wind grew stronger. The trailer rocked slightly, groaning as gusts struck its broad side. Michael tightened his grip on the wheel and slowed down, remembering the supervisor's words that morning. Take the south route. Less wind that way. He was already too far along to change course now. At dusk, he pulled over near a rest stop just east of Fort Stockton. The sun was a burning disk sinking behind the mesas, the sky turning from orange to violet. He checked the seals again out of habit, still intact, undisturbed. The barrels inside were silent, their presence almost ominous now that he thought about them. He had hauled hundreds of kinds of cargo in his life, machines, chemicals, food supplies, but something about this load felt different. It was too secretive, too neatly packaged, too heavily guarded for what it claimed to be. He leaned against the truck and lit a cigarette, watching the horizon darken. The wind whistled low across the asphalt, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and sage. He flicked the ash, crushed the cigarette under his boot, and climbed back inside. The GPS showed another 6 hours to the state line. He would drive through the night, as usual, and deliver by morning. As the engine roared back to life, he didn't notice the faint crack forming along one of the trailer's lower hinges, where the wind and vibration had begun to work their slow, silent damage. Nor did he see the first loose strap on the rear section, shifting slightly with every mile. The darkness ahead seemed endless, but comforting in its familiarity. He settled into his seat, eyes steady on the twin beams of light cutting through the night, unaware that somewhere down this same stretch of highway, the calm routine of his life was already beginning to unravel. By the time the city lights vanished completely behind him, the world was reduced to road, wind, and the low pulse of diesel through the cab floor. The highway stretched forward, indifferent and infinite, and Michael Hayes drove into it, unaware that by the next sunrise, the very cargo he carried would bring him face to face with a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about safety, honesty, and the quiet predictability of his long, lonely road. The road ahead had long dissolved into a ribbon of darkness, glimmering under the beams of Michael's headlights as if stretching infinitely into nowhere. The hum of the tires was steady, hypnotic, a low mechanical lullaby that blurred the distinction between wakefulness and fatigue. Beyond the windshield lay the boundless Texas night, cold and immense, where the desert wind whispered through dry grass and the occasional tumbleweed scuttled across the asphalt like some restless ghost. The dashboard lights painted his hands in pale green, and every so often a gust of wind pressed against the trailer, sending a subtle vibration through the steering wheel. Michael had driven through hundreds of nights like this one. There was something almost sacred about these hours, the solitude, the silence, the illusion of control within an indifferent world. Yet tonight, that feeling of peace was brittle. The wind was stronger than usual, pushing against the sides of the truck, making the mirrors tremble slightly. The memory of the supervisor's uneasy face and the strange chalk mark on the trailer wouldn't leave his mind. He tried to drown it in the rhythm of the engine, focusing on the constancy of the road. He checked the mirrors again. No cars behind him for miles. Only his own red taillights flickered faintly against the void. The radio crackled with static before fading into a weak country song about open highways and lost time. Michael smiled faintly, a bitter smile more than anything else, and adjusted his seat. The night seemed to press closer now, heavier somehow, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. He reached for his thermos and took a sip of lukewarm coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. The caffeine helped only a little. Fatigue was creeping in around the edges of his focus. He rolled down the window slightly, letting in a rush of cold air that smelled of dust and dry sage. It bit at his face, keeping him alert. The stars above were sharp and bright, the kind of stars you only saw far from cities, scattered across the sky like shards of ice. As he approached a long stretch of open plain, the wind grew erratic. Gusts hit the trailer at irregular intervals, making the steering wheel twitch in his grip. He slowed slightly, keeping both hands firm on the wheel. Every seasoned driver knew how deceptively strong desert winds could be, how they could shift a fully loaded trailer with the same ease as if it were a sheet of tin. He'd seen overturned trucks before, scattered like broken toys along embankments, their cargo spilled across the ground. He'd always assumed those drivers had been careless. Now, with the wind hissing around him, he wasn't so sure. The landscape on either side was invisible except for the occasional shape of a mesquite bush or a sloping rise of sand. The moon hung low, half covered by drifting clouds, casting uneven patches of light across the road. For miles, he drove without seeing another vehicle. The isolation was total. Then, somewhere far ahead, two pinpricks of light appeared, the headlights of an approaching car. He kept his eyes on them as they grew larger, until they flashed past in a blur of motion, gone as quickly as they came. The sudden contrast of light and darkness left his vision swimming for a moment. When it cleared, something darted into the road. It happened too fast to think. A pale shape, low to the ground, bounding across the lane. Michael's body reacted before his mind did. He jerked the wheel to the right, instinct overriding experience. The tires screamed in protest, and the world tilted. The trailer swayed violently, the weight shifting in a slow, unstoppable rhythm. He tried to correct it, steering into the skid, but the wind caught him broadside at the worst possible moment. The sound of metal grinding against asphalt tore through the night. The entire rig twisted, the trailer fishtailing across the lane, momentum wrenching the cab sideways. The headlights swung wildly, illuminating flashes of sand, scrub, and sky before the truck slammed onto its side with a deafening crash. Everything became noise and motion. The shriek of tearing steel, the hiss of air brakes, the cascade of shattered glass. Then silence. For a few seconds, Michael couldn't move. The world seemed to hum faintly around him as if underwater. His breath came in ragged bursts, the air thick with the stench of diesel and burnt rubber. He blinked hard, trying to focus. The cab was tilted at an angle, the windshield spiderwebbed with cracks. The dashboard lights flickered weakly. His seatbelt had locked tight, pressing into his shoulder, but he was alive. That realization came slowly, as if from far away. Alive. He released the belt with trembling fingers and tried to push open the door. It resisted for a moment, then gave way with a groan of metal. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of dust and chemical fumes. He crawled out, boots scraping against the tilted side of the cab, and stumbled onto the road. The truck lay sprawled across both lanes, a massive steel carcass under the pale moonlight. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing hard, looking at the wreck. His headlights still burned, casting long skewed shadows across the asphalt. In the dim light, he could see the gash torn along the side of the trailer where the impact had ripped through the metal. The cargo, those neat, identical blue barrels, had spilled onto the road and down the slope of the embankment. Dozens of them rolling slowly or lying cracked open, their contents glistening faintly. Michael staggered toward them, disoriented but driven by the instinct to assess the damage. The barrels were everywhere, some dented, some whole, a few split open completely. A thick, oily liquid seeped across the pavement, reflecting the light in uneven patches. The smell was strange, not the sharp bite of fuel or oil, but something subtler, chemical, almost sweet. He crouched beside one of the ruptured barrels, peering inside. The liquid shimmered faintly, with what looked like small sealed packets floating within it. He frowned, confused. Industrial emulsions didn't come packaged like that. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans, trying to make sense of it. Somewhere behind him, the sound of approaching engines echoed faintly across the night. He turned and saw headlights. 2 cars, slowing as they neared the wreck. Relief washed over him for a brief second. Help was coming. The first vehicle, an old pickup, pulled to the shoulder, and a man jumped out, shouting to ask if he was all right. Michael nodded numbly, his mind still half lost in shock. The man ran back to his truck, grabbed a flashlight, and began scanning the scene. "You're lucky," the stranger muttered. "That's one hell of a crash." Within minutes, more cars appeared, forming a line along the road. Someone called 911. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance, growing closer. Michael sat down on the edge of the asphalt, his hands trembling. The adrenaline was wearing off now, replaced by hollow exhaustion. He looked at the spilled barrels again, their blue surfaces gleaming under the rotating lights of the arriving patrol car. Something about them felt wrong, profoundly wrong, though he couldn't yet explain why. The paramedics reached him first. A young woman in a reflective jacket knelt beside him, shining a small light into his eyes, checking his pulse. "No fractures," she murmured to her partner. "He's in shock, but stable." They wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, their voices calm and practiced. He barely heard them. His gaze kept drifting toward the wreck, toward the barrels lying like silent sentinels across the highway. The police officer in charge began directing traffic, setting up flares and cones. Another officer walked toward Michael, asking for his license and delivery papers. He handed them over automatically, watching as the man examined the forms under the beam of his flashlight. "What were you carrying?" the officer asked. "Industrial emulsions," Michael replied quietly. "Construction materials." The officer's expression didn't change, but his eyes lingered on the scattered barrels. "Looks like quite a mess," he said. "We'll get this cleaned up." He turned away, motioning for another patrol car to block the far lane. As the flashing lights painted the scene in pulses of red and blue, Michael felt the strangeness of the moment deepen. The barrels gleamed like sentient things, their contents catching the light in strange, shifting reflections. A few had rolled far down the embankment, one resting half submerged in a shallow ditch where the oily liquid mingled with mud. He thought again of the sealed packets he'd seen floating inside, the faint white edges just visible under the surface. It didn't make sense. No one packaged emulsions that way. He wanted to say something, to tell someone what he'd seen, but his throat felt dry, his mind fogged by exhaustion. Somewhere in the blur of activity, the flashing lights, the shouts of men unloading equipment, the hiss of the tow truck's hydraulics, a single, inexplicable dread took root. He couldn't have said what it was exactly. Perhaps it was the smell, faintly chemical and wrong, or the way the paramedics had instinctively stepped back from the leaking barrels, as if not wanting to get too close. He looked up at the sky. The stars had disappeared behind a bank of clouds. The wind had shifted again, carrying the scent of rain. Across the desert plain, the horizon was silent and endless, indifferent to what had just happened. By the time the clock struck past midnight, the scene was fully illuminated by floodlights from the tow trucks. The road shimmered faintly with the slickness of spilled fluid, and the barrels had been gathered into a rough cluster for inspection. Michael sat in the open door of an ambulance, watching numbly as the police began to photograph the wreck. The air was heavy with diesel fumes and the murmur of radios. He told himself it had been an accident, nothing more, nothing less. He'd overcorrected, the wind had caught him, and luck had spared his life. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the accident had revealed something that was never meant to be seen. The wind that had overturned his truck felt almost like a force of fate, prying open a secret he didn't yet understand. When the paramedic finally told him he was free to leave after giving his statement, he looked back one last time at the rows of blue barrels glistening under artificial light. They seemed almost to glow, eerie and out of place against the dark road. Somewhere behind them, a faint glimmer caught his eye, the reflection of a flashlight over a torn label, half hidden by spilled liquid. He didn't know then that this would be the image that would haunt him for years. The cold shimmer of blue plastic under the desert moon, the quiet hum of distant engines, and the faint, impossible certainty that what lay inside those barrels was something no driver was ever meant to carry across an American highway. The world had become a blur of flashing lights and motionless shadows by the time the paramedics left him sitting on the cold edge of the asphalt, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of antiseptic. His hands were still shaking, though less from the chill and more from the shock that had not yet worn off. The roar of engines, the sharp crackle of radios, and the distant murmur of voices mixed into a single low hum that filled the night air. Somewhere nearby, the tow trucks were already positioning themselves, their mechanical arms glinting in the harsh artificial light. The smell of diesel mingled with the chemical tang seeping from the broken barrels scattered across the highway. Michael Hayes sat silently, eyes fixed on the wreck of his truck lying sideways like a wounded beast. The headlights had gone out, leaving the twisted metal half illuminated by the floodlights the police had set up. From where he sat, he could see the blue barrels lying in disarray, some dented, others cracked, a few leaking a viscous fluid that spread slowly along the asphalt, forming dark puddles. The color of the liquid shifted oddly under the light, a dull sheen that didn't look like oil or paint. He rubbed his temples, feeling the pulse of a headache beginning behind his eyes. He had survived worse accidents in his younger years, but this one felt different. There was something too deliberate about it, too strange. Every detail, the wind, the sudden animal, the way the trailer had tipped, felt like pieces of a larger pattern he couldn't quite see. He told himself it was just fatigue and shock, yet deep inside, an instinct told him that what lay in those barrels was not what his paperwork claimed. He stood up slowly, ignoring the paramedic's warning to stay seated, and walked toward the edge of the scene where the barrels were clustered. A young officer stepped into his path, lifting a hand. "Sir, please stay behind the line. We're assessing hazardous materials." Michael nodded, though he barely heard the words. His attention was fixed on one particular barrel lying on its side, its lid torn loose. A slick of liquid had pooled around it, reflecting the lights like an oil stain. But within that liquid, he thought he saw shapes, small, rectangular outlines floating just beneath the surface. He blinked, trying to focus, but before he could step closer, another officer dragged a length of yellow tape across the area, sealing it off. The young officer who had stopped him spoke again, this time with a little more authority. You did the right thing calling us right away, sir. Just stay clear, all right? We've got specialists coming." His tone was calm, professional, but Michael noticed the slight tension in his eyes, the kind of look a man gives when something doesn't fit what he expects. He backed away, wrapping the blanket tighter around himself. The night had grown colder now, and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and faint chemical residue. A few yards away, the paramedics were packing up their equipment, while two officers took photographs of the damaged truck. One of them pointed to the Plomby seal that still hung, twisted but intact, from the door hinge. Another took notes, occasionally glancing toward Michael, as if assessing whether he was part of the problem or just unlucky. He watched them work with detached focus. The whole scene had become unreal, a strange theater of order imposed on chaos. Every movement of the officers seemed rehearsed, every gesture deliberate. They were professionals, yes, but there was also caution in their behavior, a quiet unease. No one wanted to touch the barrels directly. They used gloves, tools, even poles to move them into position for photographs. Whatever was inside those containers, it wasn't something anyone wanted to get on their skin. A small group of onlookers had gathered further down the road, their faces pale and curious in the glare of the emergency lights. Someone was recording on a phone until a state trooper told them to back off. The distant hum of traffic returning to its normal rhythm filled the air again as the unaffected lanes reopened. Life was moving on beyond the flashing lights, but Michael remained frozen in that patch of night, unable to follow. One of the officers approached him, a tall man with a flashlight clipped to his vest and the faint gray of early middle age around his temples. His nameplate read R. Johnson. He crouched slightly to meet Michael's eyes. "You're the driver?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "Yes," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "Michael Hayes, Darlon Freight." Johnson nodded. "You're lucky. Rollovers like that don't usually end this clean." His tone was neutral, but his eyes flicked toward the wreck. "What were you hauling?" "Industrial emulsions," Michael replied automatically. "Non-hazardous. Construction materials." The officer studied him for a moment, then looked toward the barrels. "Non-hazardous, huh? Doesn't look like any batch I've seen before." He straightened and gestured for one of the other officers to bring over the paperwork Michael had handed in earlier. He examined it under his flashlight, his brow furrowing. "Mind if we keep this for the report?" "Of course," Michael said, though his heart had begun to thud harder. Johnson's tone remained professional, but there was something probing in his next question. "You pick this load up yourself?" "Yes, at the company's yard in Houston." "You watch them load it?" "Most of it. Forklifts, sealed barrels, looked standard." The officer nodded, jotting a few notes on a pad. "All right. We'll have a hazardous materials team check the contents before we move anything else. You just sit tight for now. Someone from the department might need a full statement later." As he walked away, Michael noticed the subtle shift in the officer's posture. He wasn't treating this as a simple accident anymore. There was purpose now in the way he spoke to his team, quiet urgency in the way they marked the positions of the barrels, careful precision in how they documented every lid, every crack, every spill. The hum of the scene deepened as more vehicles arrived. A white van with the insignia of the Texas Department of Public Safety parked beside the patrol cars, and several men in protective suits emerged, carrying sealed equipment cases. They moved deliberately, inspecting the barrels from a distance before kneeling to take samples of the spilled liquid. The night was now alive with the sound of cameras clicking, radios squawking, and the rhythmic hiss of the wind across the desert plain. Michael felt small amid it all, a bystander to something vast and complicated that had erupted from what should have been an ordinary night. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the first faint streaks of dawn were beginning to color the sky. The desert beyond the crash site looked endless, indifferent to the turmoil on its edge. He wished, with a deep ache, that he could rewind the last few hours, undo the curve of his hands on the steering wheel, the split-second reflex that had sent the truck tumbling. He looked down at his boots, streaked with dust and the same faint residue that covered the ground around the barrels. He rubbed it with his finger. It felt almost waxy, sticky even, not quite like oil. He wiped it on the blanket, uneasy. When the first rays of light finally touched the wreck, the scene changed subtly. The blue of the barrels looked brighter now, almost luminous. The spilled fluid caught the sunlight in a way that made it shimmer unnaturally. One of the specialists bent over a cracked container and called for his supervisor. The tone of his voice was tight, surprised. Within moments, more of them gathered around the open barrel. Michael couldn't hear their words, but he saw their expressions, cautious, tense, like men who had just uncovered something they hadn't expected. Johnson joined them, leaning in to look, his brow furrowing deeper. Then he straightened abruptly and gave a quiet order to one of his team. Another officer walked quickly toward Michael. "Sir, we need you to step a little further back. Just precautionary." Michael obeyed, moving behind the new line of tape they stretched across the area. He glanced again at Johnson, who was now on his radio, speaking in a low tone. A few words carried on the wind. "Notify DEA, confirm contents, secure perimeter." Those words hit Michael like a physical blow. DEA, drug enforcement. He stared at the barrels, his mind struggling to process the implication. That couldn't be right. It didn't make sense. He was just a driver. He had done everything by the book, every procedure, every inspection. But deep down, a hollow realization began to take shape. Those sealed packets he had glimpsed weren't some part of a chemical mix. They were something far more deliberate, something hidden. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. A team of federal agents arrived, their presence quiet but commanding. They spoke briefly with Johnson, then began photographing every barrel, every spill, every mark on the road. Samples were sealed, tagged, and placed into evidence containers. One of the agents knelt beside the cracked barrel Michael had seen first and carefully lifted out a sealed white package coated in clear residue. It was about the size of a brick, its corners sharp, its surface smooth beneath the plastic. The agent held it up for his superior, who examined it for only a moment before nodding grimly. From that point, everything changed. The road was closed completely. The press was kept away, and anyone without clearance was escorted off-site. Michael was moved to a patrol car and told to wait there while the investigation continued. Through the windshield, he watched as the men in suits worked systematically, turning his accident into a full-scale operation. He felt like a ghost in his own story, invisible and powerless. Hours later, when the sun had climbed high enough to bleach the sky pale, Johnson returned to the car. He opened the door and crouched beside him, his tone gentler now. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "we're still confirming details, but it looks like the cargo you were carrying wasn't what your paperwork said it was. You understand what that means?" Michael stared at him, his throat dry. "I didn't know," he managed. "I swear I didn't know." "I believe you," Johnson said quietly, "but we'll need a full statement. This is now a federal case. You're a witness, not a suspect, at least for now. But you're going to have to stay available." Michael nodded, though his thoughts were a storm. A simple delivery, a routine drive, and now he was sitting beside a crime scene worth millions, surrounded by men who spoke in code and wore gloves to handle what had once been his cargo. When they finally let him stand again, the wreck was already being loaded onto a flatbed. The barrels were gone, sealed in unmarked containers. Only the stain on the road remained, a dark patch shimmering faintly under the midday sun. He looked at it one last time before turning away, the weight of everything pressing against his chest. He didn't know it yet, but that morning marked the dividing line in his life, the end of his quiet, uneventful existence on the road, and the beginning of something far larger and far darker than he could have ever imagined. The wind swept across the desert once more, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of the spilled liquid, as if erasing the traces of the night that had changed everything. By the time the morning sun had climbed high enough to wash the desert in pale gold, the crash site had already transformed into something far more than an accident scene. What had begun as a simple rollover had turned into a perimeter swarming with police, state patrols, and federal agents whose movements were sharp, quiet, and deliberate. The long stretch of highway, usually humming with traffic and wind, was now cordoned off by yellow tape and blinking cruisers. Reporters had tried to approach, but had been kept at a distance. Onlookers were pushed away. Photographs were forbidden. And in the midst of all that contained chaos, Michael Hayes sat beside an emergency vehicle, silent, still, his thoughts circling the same truth he could not yet face, that he had been carrying something meant never to be discovered. He felt like a man detached from himself, as though his body remained sitting on the hard bench while his mind wandered somewhere far beyond the desert horizon. The paramedics had long since cleared him, though one of them had offered a quiet warning not to drive for a day or two. His body ached where the seatbelt had caught him, but pain wasn't what preoccupied him. It was the strange, expanding realization that everything around him had changed the instant those barrels cracked open. Nothing about his life, his job, his routine, his quiet anonymity felt certain anymore. He noticed a new arrival then. A dark SUV rolled up behind the barricade, and a tall man stepped out, adjusting the brim of his hat against the glare. He moved with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to walking into scenes like this and taking charge. The badge on his belt caught the light, and his voice, when he spoke to one of the troopers, carried across the distance with a deep steadiness. That was the first time Michael saw Officer Ray Johnson, the man who, without intending it, would come to define the next chapter of his life. Johnson walked with purpose, but without hurry. There was no panic in his stride, only measured curiosity. He approached the wreck slowly, his eyes scanning everything: the skid marks, the position of the barrels, the damaged trailer, the faint stains on the asphalt. He was the kind of man who saw details others missed. His uniform bore the light dust of travel, suggesting he had been called in from elsewhere. When he reached the line of tape, he paused, surveyed the scene, then motioned for one of the officers to meet him. They exchanged a few words, brief, precise, before he crossed into the secured area. Michael watched him move among the barrels, crouching beside one, touching the rim of another with a gloved hand, his expression unreadable. The younger officers followed him with a quiet respect. Even from a distance, Michael could tell that this man carried authority not from rank alone, but from experience. He had seen enough of life's hidden corners to recognize when something wasn't as it appeared. When Johnson finally approached him, the sound of his boots on gravel was steady, unhurried. He stopped a few feet away, studying Michael for a long moment before speaking. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and calm, the kind that didn't rush to judgment. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Officer Ray Johnson, State Police," he said evenly. "You're the driver of this rig?" "Yes," Michael answered, his voice rough. "You're lucky to be alive," Johnson continued, glancing briefly toward the overturned truck. "Most rollovers like that end badly. You remember what caused it?" Michael hesitated. "An animal. Came out of nowhere. I tried to avoid it, lost control." Johnson nodded once, as if filing the information away. "It happens. Roads like these, open plains, animals cross all the time." He let the words hang for a second before continuing. "We're still assessing your cargo. You said earlier it was non-hazardous material." "That's what my paperwork said," Michael replied. Johnson's gaze drifted toward the line of blue barrels glinting under the sun. "Well, something about that cargo doesn't sit right. The labels are wrong, too vague, and those barrels don't match any standard shipping registry for construction emulsions." He turned back to Michael. "You noticed anything unusual when you picked it up?" Michael thought of the security guards, the silence of the workers, the chalk mark on the trailer. He almost mentioned it, then stopped himself. "Nothing that stood out," he said after a pause. "It looked like any other load." The officer studied him for a moment longer, then seemed to accept the answer. "All right. We'll handle it from here. You did the right thing calling it in right away." He gave a small nod before walking back toward the wreck. From where he sat, Michael could see Johnson methodically directing his team. He didn't bark orders, he spoke quietly, efficiently, and people moved. He marked off sections of the site, repositioned floodlights, and had a team photograph every barrel from multiple angles. When a technician handed him a torn scrap of label, Johnson examined it with the careful patience of a man who knew that truth was always hidden in small things. Then he crouched again, brushing his fingers lightly over the residue that stained the asphalt. The gesture was almost instinctive, like an old habit formed from years of observation. He lifted his fingers to his nose, hesitated, then looked toward his team. "Get me the chemical analysis kit," he said quietly. The process stretched for hours. Federal agents returned with testing kits and scanners. They opened one of the barrels under Johnson's supervision, lifting the lid with cautious precision. From his vantage point near the ambulance, Michael watched as they peered inside. The sunlight struck the surface of the liquid, revealing faint, pale packages submerged within. There was a murmur among the team, a subtle shift in the air, like the first tremor before a storm. Johnson's expression hardened slightly. He reached for the radio, clipped to his vest, and spoke into it in a tone that carried no emotion. Within minutes, the atmosphere changed. The other officers straightened, began forming a wider perimeter, and the technician stepped back from the barrels. Johnson made a brief call to his headquarters, his voice calm but low. Though Michael couldn't hear the words, he caught fragments. Narcotics, unmarked, federal jurisdiction. The sun burned high above them, merciless and white. The road shimmered with heat, and every sound, the rustle of the wind, the clicking of cameras, the crunch of boots, seemed sharper in the heavy air. Johnson moved with deliberate care between his officers, checking every barrel that had been opened. His face remained unreadable, but when he spoke again, his tone had changed slightly, becoming colder, more precise. By early afternoon, the first official statements began to take shape. The chemical tests had confirmed what everyone now suspected, but no one had wanted to say aloud. The blue barrels were not carrying industrial emulsions. They contained liquid mixed with tightly wrapped packages, bricks of narcotics disguised within the fluid, concealed so cleverly that only the accident had exposed them. Michael watched it all unfold like someone watching another man's life collapse in slow motion. Every step the officers took, every photograph they snapped, every word they spoke seemed to distance him further from the world he had known. He was questioned again, this time by a different group, state investigators who treated him kindly but carefully, as if he were a fragile witness to something dangerous. When Johnson returned to him, his tone was softer than before, but carried the weight of what they had learned. "Mr. Hayes, I need you to understand something," he said. "You're not in trouble. Everything we've seen so far suggests you had no idea what you were carrying. But this," he gestured toward the barrels, "is serious. You've stumbled into something much larger than you or me." Michael could only nod. "How much?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Johnson hesitated. "Enough to fund a small army," he said finally. "This isn't a small-time operation. Whoever put that cargo together knew exactly what they were doing." As evening settled again over the desert, the lights of the investigation still burned bright. The highway remained closed, and the air was filled with the steady drone of generators. Michael sat on the hood of a patrol car drinking water from a plastic bottle one of the officers had given him. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass of the nearby truck window. A tired man, older somehow than he had been yesterday. He could see Johnson a few yards away speaking to a federal agent. There was something about the officer's composure that gave him an odd comfort. Amid the confusion, Johnson was the only constant, a man who treated the situation not with panic but with purpose. When their eyes met across the scene, Johnson gave him a brief nod, the kind that said without words, "You're safe now." It was a simple gesture, but it anchored Michael in the whirlwind of uncertainty. The night deepened, and the wind began to rise again, carrying sand across the highway. The site was still alive with movement, but now it was controlled, almost quiet. The wrecked truck had been towed away, leaving only dark stains on the pavement and the fading smell of diesel and chemicals. Johnson walked over one last time before leaving. "We'll get in touch tomorrow," he said. "There'll be more questions, but for now get some rest if you can. You've had a long night." Michael nodded, his voice too tired for words. As Johnson's silhouette disappeared into the glare of the floodlights, Michael felt a strange mix of gratitude and fear. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. This man, this calm, dark-eyed officer, had walked into his life at the exact moment it was falling apart. Somewhere, deep inside, a quiet voice told him that their paths were far from finished crossing. The desert wind howled through the empty stretch of highway as the last trucks pulled away, leaving behind only a silence that felt heavier than the noise. Michael remained seated for a long time after everyone else had gone, staring at the distant horizon where day bled into night. He didn't yet understand that the calm, methodical figure of Officer Ray Johnson would soon become not just the man who solved the mystery, but the bridge between his old life and the new, uncertain world that waited beyond this accident. A world where truth was hidden in barrels, and justice had to be fought for one piece of evidence at a time. The morning that followed was bright and unfeeling, as if the desert sun had no interest in what had happened during the long hours of the previous night. By 9 o'clock, the heat had already begun to rise in shimmering waves off the blacktop, casting mirage-like illusions across the damaged stretch of highway. The wreckage was gone now. Michael's overturned truck had been hauled away before sunrise, and the blue barrels that had once spilled across the asphalt like scattered bones had been sealed into armored transport containers. Yet the scene still bore the scars of the discovery. Faint outlines of fluid stains, the scorched rubber marks from locked brakes, and the deep grooves left by the trailer as it had slid and rolled. Yellow tape fluttered lazily in the wind, a fragile boundary between the ordinary world and the place where a massive secret had been exposed by chance. Michael sat beneath a canvas shade erected by the authorities, not out of comfort, but to keep witnesses from baking under the relentless sun. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the barrels cracking open again, saw the viscous liquid spilling out, and those white packages slowly surfacing like submerged evidence. His body ached in places he hadn't noticed the night before, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The events had detached him from time, and all that remained now was the slow, suffocating weight of waiting for answers, for explanations, for someone to tell him what his role in all of this really meant. Ray Johnson had arrived again just after sunrise. He was still wearing the same uniform, now dusted with the faint red tint of the desert, but his posture had not faltered. He greeted his team with nods and concise words, then moved immediately to a makeshift command table set up near the shoulder of the highway. There, he was joined by 2 agents from the DEA, both in plain clothes, but with badges clipped to their belts, and that same unreadable look of men accustomed to uncovering ugly truths. Michael watched them from a distance, reading their movements, noting how the agents leaned in when Johnson spoke and how they occasionally glanced over at him, their expressions neither hostile nor warm. He was a question mark to them, a variable that needed definition. They didn't know whether he was a clueless pawn or a participant in something larger. Michael didn't know how to feel about that. He wanted to shout that he was innocent, that he'd only done what every trucker does, deliver what he was told, trust the manifest, move from A to B without asking questions. But he also knew that this time it wasn't going to be that simple. One of the agents finally approached him with a laptop and a folder. His name was Clark, thin, older, professional in that way that suggested he'd seen both hardened criminals and frightened civilians and rarely confused one for the other. He didn't sit down. Instead, he stood over Michael and opened the folder, letting the edge of a glossy photo catch the sun. It was an image of one of the white packages retrieved from the barrel, its surface slick with residue, its corners marked with faint stamps, symbols that looked like parts of old cargo codes, familiar to those who knew what to look for. "We've run tests on 6 of the packages so far," Clark said. "Each one contains a different composition, but the purity is the same. 78 to 80% pure cocaine. No additives, no compression agents. This isn't street grade. This is cartel-level inventory smuggled through what we believe was an industrial cover operation." Michael didn't respond immediately. His throat had gone dry, and the words landed with the force of a sentence. He stared at the image, then at the folder as Clark flipped to a second page. It showed an X-ray scan of one of the sealed barrels. The packages were packed within the liquid, floating just beneath the surface in carefully layered formation. Clark closed the folder, then finally sat across from him. "Mr. Hayes, your paperwork states that you picked up a shipment of construction emulsions from a warehouse in East Houston. But here's what we've confirmed so far. That warehouse doesn't belong to the company listed in your delivery documents. The lease is under a shell corporation that's changed names 3 times in the past 6 months. None of the listed owners are real, and the last 2 registered drivers who hauled similar shipments out of there have since disappeared off record. One filed a police report 2 weeks ago for suspected surveillance. The other hasn't been heard from since May." Michael stared at him. "I don't know anything about that. I swear to you, I didn't know what was in that cargo." Clark nodded without expression. "That's what Officer Johnson believes, and so far we don't have any evidence suggesting otherwise. But you were in the middle of a smuggling operation large enough to be part of a transnational pipeline. Do you understand what that means? That amount of product, if it had made it to its destination, would have funded months, maybe years of operations. The street value of what we found in your truck exceeds $28 million. Michael's breath caught. He had heard of seizures that big on the news, watched them being discussed in headlines, read about them in trucker forums as cautionary tales. But to be sitting at the center of one, unknowingly, left him hollowed out with disbelief. "What happens now?" he asked finally, voice low. Clark leaned forward, folding his hands. "Now we trace everything. Your route, your GPS logs, your refueling stops. We re-examine every call made from your dispatcher's phone, every surveillance camera near that warehouse. And we watch to see who tries to clean up the mess you exposed. Because make no mistake, Mr. Hayes, someone out there just lost a lot of money. They're going to want to know what went wrong, and they're going to start asking questions." Michael felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the wind. Clark stood and motioned for one of the officers to take over. As he walked away, Johnson approached again, carrying a tablet and a bottle of water, which he handed silently to Michael before sitting on the low bench beside him. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," Johnson said after a pause, "but this is something different. These people are smart. They build fronts with care. They piggyback on legitimate infrastructure. They use regular routes, real companies, and people like you because no one would question it." Michael shook his head slowly. "I should have known something was wrong. The guards, the way they loaded the truck, the paperwork, it didn't feel right." Johnson gave a faint smile, more of an acknowledgement than amusement. "You'd be surprised how many people notice things and keep driving. Most of them don't end up here. But that doesn't mean they're safe." They sat in silence for a while, watching the technicians catalog the last of the physical evidence. Every barrel had been accounted for, sealed, photographed, and hauled into evidence trucks bound for state facilities. The paperwork alone would take days. The real investigation was only beginning. Johnson turned the tablet toward him, showing satellite images of the warehouse compound in Houston. "We think they use this facility as a central node. The pattern matches. Outgoing shipments every 3 days, no inbound logs, no public-facing contact information. If you hadn't crashed that truck, they would have kept running it until something worse happened. You interrupted a pipeline, Michael, whether you meant to or not." Michael didn't feel heroic. He felt violated, used. The truck had been his livelihood, the road his quiet way of surviving the world. Now it had become a weapon in someone else's scheme, and he had been holding the trigger without knowing. "We'll be coordinating with the feds from here on," Johnson continued. "This isn't just about your cargo anymore. It's about the network that put it there. Someone signed that manifest. Someone loaded that trailer. Someone made sure that whatever system flagged random inspections skipped over your route. That takes money, access, and very careful planning." Michael looked up. "Am I in danger?" Johnson met his gaze. "Right now, probably not, but we're not going to take any chances. We'll assign you protection until we finish the initial sweep. You'll be listed as a protected witness for now." The words sank in slowly. Protected witness. The phrase conjured images of hidden motels, anonymous phone numbers, lives uprooted, and identities erased. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered. "No one ever does," Johnson replied. As the last container truck pulled away and the command post began to wind down, Michael was escorted to a plain state vehicle. He turned back once, taking a final look at the stretch of road where the wreck had occurred. There was nothing left now but the heat rising from the pavement and the memory of barrels that should never have been there. He climbed into the car without another word, the door shutting behind him with a dull finality. Johnson spoke briefly with the driver, then stepped away. As the vehicle pulled out onto the highway, Michael looked at him through the rear window. The officer stood alone in the sun, arms crossed, watching the road like it still held secrets. And somewhere, deep inside, Michael knew that it did. The motel they placed him in was the kind of place where the carpets felt sticky even when they looked clean, where the lamps flickered for a second before holding their glow, and where the silence was so complete it made Michael uneasy. It was located just outside of El Paso, far enough from the crash site to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough that the agents could reach him within an hour. Michael had spent his first night there lying on a stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling with its faint water stains and spider-webbed cracks, trying to piece together how his life had veered so drastically off course. The day after the crash had been consumed by procedures. He had given his official statement to both state and federal authorities, once at the command post, once again at a regional facility. They asked everything, from what he had eaten the morning of the pickup to whether he'd noticed anyone following him on the road. They logged every detail he could remember, the security guards at the warehouse, the faded chalk mark on the trailer, the odd silences during loading, even the way the supervisor hadn't met his eyes when handing him the paperwork. Johnson had been present through much of it, leaning quietly against the wall, listening more than speaking. It was only later, when the formal questioning ended, that he gave Michael a quiet nod of approval and told him he'd done the right thing. That nod, brief as it was, lingered in Michael's mind more than anything the agents had said, but rest didn't come. Sleep remained elusive, hovering behind the curtain of adrenaline and unease that now clung to him. He kept thinking about the blue barrels, their cold plastic sides, the faint shimmer of the concealed bricks beneath the oily surface. He remembered how he'd checked the seals before leaving the yard in Houston, how everything had appeared intact and official. He had taken photos of the Plomby, logged the route in his GPS, followed every protocol. Yet, despite all of that, he had become the courier of one of the largest narcotics hauls in the state's history. The thought kept looping in his head, each time duller but no less disturbing. He had been a moving piece on someone else's board. 2 days after the crash, Johnson arrived unannounced at the motel. He wore plain clothes this time: dark jeans, a pale shirt, and a jacket that concealed his badge. He looked less like a state officer and more like someone who didn't want to be noticed. Michael opened the door without a word and stepped back to let him in. The small room smelled of old air conditioning and cheap soap, but Johnson didn't seem to mind. He sat in the chair near the window, glanced briefly at the closed blinds, then turned to Michael. "Something's moving," he said. "We've got pressure coming down the line. Your company, Darlin Freight, is under a federal audit. The Houston yard you picked up from was scrubbed clean 24 hours after the accident. Cameras were either wiped or shut off, logs missing, staff gone. It was a ghost town by the time we served the first warrant." Michael leaned against the dresser, arms crossed. "So they knew we found it?" Johnson nodded. "Or they expected we would. What matters now is who gave the order, and that's where you come in again." Michael blinked slowly. "I told them everything I know." "I believe you," Johnson said. "But you don't just get a load like that by accident. Someone had to schedule it. Someone at your dispatch had to assign it. Someone falsified the documents. And I need you to help me find out who." Michael let out a slow breath. "They won't tell me anything. Not now." "They don't have to," Johnson said. "I already got access to their internal systems through the audit. I just need you to walk me through how assignments come in, who approves them, who communicates what to the drivers, what's routine, what isn't." For the next 2 hours, Michael explained everything he knew: how dispatch usually texted or called the night before a load, how paperwork was often emailed in advance, but sometimes handed off in person at the yard, how there were certain drivers who always got the high-paying runs without explanation, and how those same drivers never talked much. He described the office staff. Margaret, who did payroll and scheduling, always polite but guarded. Evan, the younger logistics assistant, who had started a few months earlier and had asked strange questions about off-hours runs. Johnson listened intently, occasionally jotting notes or tapping things into his phone. He asked follow-up questions that Michael hadn't expected. What kind of coffee the supervisor drank, what radio station usually played in the yard's waiting area, whether any new vehicles had appeared recently without company branding. By the end of the session, Johnson stood and stretched. "This is good. You've seen more than you realized. It's just a matter of context." Michael looked at him wearily. "You think they've done this before?" "I think this was load number 23, Johnson said flatly. "We've been reviewing satellite imagery and delivery manifests. Your trailer was one of at least a dozen that left that warehouse in the past 90 days. Same route, same kind of cargo. But this time something went wrong. You crashed. You exposed them. They weren't ready for that." Michael sat down on the bed, head in his hands. "Jesus." Johnson's voice softened. "They used you because you were clean. No red flags, solid driving record, reliable. That's how they operate. They wrap their operations around people who would never ask the wrong questions because they've never had a reason to." "Until now," Michael muttered. That evening, after Johnson left, Michael's phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. When he answered, a female voice on the other end identified herself as Special Agent Maria Ellis from the DEA task force now handling the federal portion of the case. She was calm and professional, asking if he was in a safe location, confirming that Johnson had visited. Then she asked him not to leave the motel for the next 48 hours, unless accompanied by law enforcement. There had been, she said carefully, some unexpected surveillance activity around the edges of the investigation. Michael didn't ask for details. He didn't want to know whether someone had followed him or if someone had parked across the street with binoculars and a camera. He simply said yes, hung up, and locked the door. The next day was a blur of stillness. He watched the muted television, drank coffee that tasted like burnt plastic, and tried not to think about what might be waiting outside. When Johnson returned the following afternoon, he brought new files, new names, and something else. A photograph of a man Michael had once seen only from a distance, a tall figure with sharp features who had arrived at the yard a few weeks ago in a black SUV, stayed in the office for 20 minutes, then left without a word. Michael had thought nothing of it at the time. Johnson placed the photo on the table and pointed. "That's Victor Salas, known associate of a cartel logistics cell operating in Arizona and West Texas. We believe he's one of the architects of the smuggling operation. And you saw him." That matters. Michael studied the photo. It felt strange to see the face again, now outlined in ink, tagged with federal classification codes, but the recognition was immediate. He didn't talk to anyone. He didn't need to. He's the kind who watches, supervises, makes sure the system runs without interruption. And now it's interrupted. Johnson nodded, which means he'll be looking for new ways to reestablish the route. Or he'll be trying to find out who caused the disruption. That's why we're moving forward fast. Later that night, Johnson gave him an update. Federal teams had traced payments to a shell company operating out of Mexico City, with wiring activity that linked it to more than a dozen accounts across the southern U.S. Each account was tied to a different logistics contractor, each one with a nearly spotless record. They were building a new network, one designed to mimic legitimate commerce so closely that even customs officials had a hard time telling the difference. But now, thanks to a crash on a Texas highway, a single thread had begun to unravel the whole web. Michael couldn't sleep again that night. He sat at the small motel desk with the window half open, listening to the hum of insects and the faint rumble of trucks on the distant highway. Every time an engine passed, he felt his shoulders tense. He had been a trucker for 2 decades, and now every passing rig sounded like a threat. He thought about calling his daughter just to hear a normal voice, but decided against it. Johnson had advised against using personal lines for the time being. Too risky. Instead, he wrote a message in a notebook he had found in the motel drawer, a letter he didn't plan to send, but one that helped ground his thoughts. He wrote about the road, about the barrels, about the silence that followed the crash. He wrote about Johnson, about how a stranger had become the only thing holding the chaos together. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was beginning to understand that he was no longer just a witness. He was part of the investigation now, not by choice, but by necessity. Outside, the desert wind picked up again, whispering against the window glass, reminding him that things were still moving, still watching, still waiting. The investigation stretched over weeks, each day layering itself upon the last, building a structure of procedure, surveillance, and quiet anxiety that Michael Hayes could neither escape nor fully comprehend. His world had shrunk to a motel room outside El Paso, a space measured in a bed, a desk, and the small window overlooking the endless stretch of desert. He watched the horizon every morning, noting how the sunlight shifted across the barren terrain, marking the passage of days that were otherwise indistinguishable from one another. The highway beyond, the same road where his truck had overturned, carried the hum of distant engines, each vehicle a reminder that life continued beyond the bounds of his forced isolation. Yet, he remained trapped within this invisible perimeter, tethered by the investigation and the need for protection. Federal agents came and went with a rhythm that seemed inexorably tied to the heartbeat of the operation. Johnson remained a constant presence, moving between briefings, satellite imagery, phone calls, and Michael's room with an efficiency that belied the magnitude of the case. Johnson explained the unfolding situation in pieces that slowly painted a vast and complex picture. The network they had uncovered was sophisticated, a web of shell companies, falsified documents, coded communications, and legitimate-looking transport schedules that had, until the accident, allowed enormous quantities of narcotics to move across state lines undetected. Michael had carried one load of a dozen blue barrels, but it was merely one node in a system that spanned Texas and Arizona, and potentially farther south into Mexico. The scale of it left him reeling. He had thought of himself as a simple driver moving goods, not as a piece in an international scheme that had likely been operating for months, if not years. The authorities had quickly pieced together the financial trail. Bank accounts under the names of shell companies were linked to small logistics contractors, payments made in a pattern designed to avoid detection. Each transfer appeared innocuous, a routine business expense on paper, yet the cumulative effect revealed the enormous sums involved. Johnson had Michael walk him through the details of Darlin Freight's operations, tracing routes, stopovers, and refueling points, noting which individuals had access to which shipments. Michael's intimate knowledge of the workflow became a map that the federal task force used to cross-check against the financial and logistical data they had compiled. The simplest observations, how long a driver typically spent at a rest stop, the rotation of shifts at the warehouse, the details of logbook entries, turned out to be vital pieces of a puzzle that could otherwise have remained invisible. One afternoon, Johnson brought Michael outside for a meeting. They stood at the edge of the desert, the highway stretching east and west like a ribbon of silver in the sun, flanked by cacti and sagebrush. Johnson had a folder in his hands, thick with printouts and satellite images. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an overhead photo of the warehouse compound. The aerial shot revealed patterns invisible from the ground. Parcels stacked in a particular order, vehicles arriving and leaving at consistent intervals, and the precise placement of security cameras. Johnson explained how analysts had identified 23 shipments like Michael's in the past 90 days, each following a slightly different route but using the same method to mask the contents. The final shipment, the one Michael had delivered, had been the weakest link. The accident had exposed the operation in a way that no internal audit or routine inspection ever could. Michael absorbed it quietly, his mind oscillating between disbelief and the gnawing understanding that his life had been irrevocably altered. He had always thought that knowledge and diligence could shield him from danger, that if he followed protocol, he would remain safe. But now he realized that circumstance, chance, and the blind design of others could undo any careful plan. His crash had been an accident, yet it had rendered him central to the unraveling of a criminal enterprise. The implications were enormous, not just for the cartel operating through Houston and Arizona, but for the law enforcement agencies that had to act quickly to prevent retaliation or further criminal activity. In the days that followed, Michael was contacted repeatedly by federal agents. Each meeting involved meticulous review of his route, the sequence of stops, the personnel involved in each step, and the communications he had received from dispatch. He described how pallets were loaded, how seals were checked, and how drivers were assigned routes. He recounted the subtle irregularities he had observed, the extra guards at the warehouse, the fleeting glance of someone who seemed out of place, the chalk marks he had dismissed at the time. Each seemingly minor detail provided investigators with threads to follow, connecting the physical logistics to the digital trails of bank transfers, email correspondence, and shipping manifests. His ordinary observations became extraordinary under the scrutiny of law enforcement, revealing the deliberate sophistication of the smuggling operation. Meanwhile, Johnson coordinated with teams to secure other facilities suspected of involvement. Raids were conducted in Houston and surrounding areas, and agents recovered documents, computer logs, and evidence of shell companies. Certain employees were taken in for questioning, some implicated in falsifying records, others acting as intermediaries between legitimate business operations and the concealed narcotics. The network was far-reaching, extending into multiple states, But the accident on the highway had forced the perpetrators into defensive measures, creating vulnerabilities in their otherwise watertight operation. Michael's testimony and intimate understanding of the transportation processes had become crucial to these breakthroughs, guiding investigators through the labyrinth of legitimate fronts and coded communications. Amid this flurry of activity, Michael adjusted to the reality of being a protected witness. He was not permitted to leave the motel unaccompanied. He was instructed on precautions: avoid electronic communications that could be intercepted, keep a low profile, and report any unusual activity outside his room immediately. At first, he resented these constraints. The freedom of the highway, the solitude of long nights behind the wheel, had defined his existence. Now, he felt caged, constantly observed, and acutely aware that the consequences of his accident extended far beyond himself. Even simple gestures, such as leaving the building to stretch or check the mailbox, carried weight. Every step was calculated, measured, and recorded in the invisible ledger of security. One evening, after the first major wave of raids concluded, Johnson returned to brief him. They sat at the motel's picnic table, the sun low and casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Johnson laid out a series of maps, showing routes of previous shipments, locations of shell companies, and the network of banks used to funnel proceeds. "We've identified the key players," he said. "Victor Salas is central. The people in Houston were intermediaries. Some will go to prison, some are likely fleeing. The system is unraveling." He paused, letting Michael absorb the words. "And you helped us catch it in its early stages. Had you not crashed, the next shipment would have left without interference." Michael felt the enormity of it settle over him. The crash that had seemed catastrophic, humiliating, and disastrous now appeared in a different light. His life, which had seemed defined by routine and predictability, had intersected with something far larger, something dangerous and meticulously organized. He had been a passive actor, swept along by events, yet simultaneously, he had become the instrument through which a massive criminal operation had been exposed. It was a paradox that left him shaken and contemplative. The realization that ordinary people could, through sheer chance, alter the course of large, hidden systems was both terrifying and strangely empowering. In the following days, Michael was allowed to return briefly to familiar surroundings, though never for long. The protection detail remained, a silent presence that shadowed him whenever he left the motel. Each outing was orchestrated to minimize risk. Johnson maintained contact with him, not only to ensure his safety, but also to continue gathering insights. Every detail of the operation, from the way trucks were assigned to the methods of communication between couriers and handlers, required verification. Michael found himself recalling minutiae he had never considered important. The shape of the pallets, the routine of the forklift operators, the subtle irregularities in the seals applied to the barrels. These memories, once trivial, had become critical threads in the unraveling investigation. By the end of the month, the consequences of the crash had become clear on multiple levels. Law enforcement agencies had seized over 1.2 tons of narcotics from similar operations, valued at tens of millions of dollars. Arrests had been made across state lines, and federal charges were being filed against individuals responsible for the logistical coordination of the smuggling network. Michael's involvement had remained as a witness, and through his cooperation, authorities had been able to map the network with remarkable clarity. Yet, even as the arrests were made and evidence secured, the weight of the experience pressed heavily upon him. He was no longer merely a driver on a route. He was a participant in an event that had revealed a hidden layer of society, a system of criminal enterprise that operated under the guise of ordinary commerce. His ordinary life had been irrevocably altered by forces outside his control. In the quiet hours of the evening, Michael often sat by the motel window, looking at the long stretch of highway that now seemed both familiar and alien. He thought about the accident, the spilled barrels, the first arrival of law enforcement, and the painstakingly slow process of investigation. The desert wind carried a thin dust across the lot, and in that stillness he could feel the enormity of what had occurred. Life had a way of pushing ordinary people into extraordinary circumstances, and he had been swept up in one of the most consequential events of his career. He understood now that safety, routine, and diligence were fragile shields against the unpredictability of the world. Even the smallest divergence, a step too late, a curve misjudged, could expose truths that powerful forces had worked to conceal. Months later, when the highway was repaired and the traffic resumed its normal pace, Michael returned briefly to the area of the crash. The scars of the asphalt had faded, and the blue barrels were gone, replaced by freshly painted lines and new signage, warning of desert winds and wildlife crossings. He stood at the edge of the road, looking down the stretch that had seemed endless that night, and felt a strange combination of relief and resignation. He had survived, he had witnessed, and he had participated in the exposure of a vast criminal network. The experience had changed him. It had removed the illusion of safety that he had carried with him for decades. Officer Ray Johnson, now a constant in the unfolding aftermath, stood a few feet away, his gaze following the same horizon. He had guided Michael through the chaos, helped him navigate the legal and procedural labyrinth, and ensured his safety in the face of potential retaliation. Their silent understanding spoke volumes. A man caught in extraordinary circumstances could find allies in those who recognized the value of vigilance, diligence, and courage. Michael had been thrust into a world he had never intended to enter, but he had emerged alive, informed, and irrevocably changed. As he drove away that day, back toward a semblance of normal life, the highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of asphalt under the desert sun. Every mile reminded him of the fragility of routine and the unexpected weight of chance. He knew the story of the blue barrels, of the accident, and of the operation would linger in his mind forever, not as a tale of misfortune, but as a stark testament to how ordinary lives could intersect with extraordinary events, how random accidents could unravel hidden systems, and how even the smallest choices, whether to call the police, to observe details, to act responsibly, could alter the course of a vast, hidden world. And somewhere in the distance, the desert wind continued to whistle across the plains, carrying with it the faint, lingering echo of what had been uncovered and the quiet knowledge that the ordinary world was never as simple as it seemed. If you were shocked by this discovery, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. There are more unbelievable stories waiting for you. Click to watch the next video or explore other videos on our channel that reveal secrets you won't believe exist. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family and see who else is ready to uncover the truth.